Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thanks and congratulations to the organizers. It's really a privilege to be here with you. In three parts: where we are today, where we have some struggles, and where we might be going in the future. So Hannes, yesterday, took us from a satellite picture of the world, and then we went all the way down to the granular level of human settlements, and I'm going to do exactly the opposite. I'd like to invite you to an abstract world of international climate negotiations and what we do and how that might contribute to the important work that all of you are part of, helping at the ground level households and communities build their resilience. And I have to admit, listening to all of you, I am struggling to even understand what we mean by resilience. But that's part of the struggle, and that's Act 2. So first of all, the world as we know it today. We have heard here, and we see in the news, all kinds of different phenomena that we're dealing with. I'm lumping those into two. We're concerned about people's safety, and we're concerned about people's welfare. And so what you see here are just photographs from the past research that I used to do. It was my privilege to work with Jakob Renner and his excellent colleagues at United Nations University before I went over to the Climate Secretariat. So you have photo one. This is taken by Robin Bronin. She's working with indigenous peoples in coastal Alaska. They're having trouble with permafrost melt and rapid coastal erosion. So you see there real problems with community safety in quite land-constrained areas. Picture number two, you see non-irrigated agriculturalists trying to raise crops in Senegal. They're having, ever since the 1970s, if you talk with people on the ground, if you talk with Met offices, you're having unexpected patterns of dry spells. The rain isn't coming at the same times that it used to. There's a notable difference in the stories that grandparents will tell as their sons and daughters and as their children today. So you've seen since the 1970s what looks like what might be some kind of state change across that area of Western Africa. Picture number three was taken in a UNHCR refugee camp in Somaliland, in Ethiopia, right at the border. I took this picture doing research in 2011, just as a drought was unfolding in January, February of that year. We were talking with people about what sets them on the move, and these people that we were interviewing were coming over into Ethiopia from conflict-affected areas. But when we talked to them, one of the reasons that they were on the move was this variability in rainfall, and we're really suffering from droughts and all of the knock-on effects that drought has for the well-being of their families. So they were kind of fleeing. And then this fourth picture is from field work that we were doing a few years ago in Micronesia on the island of Kosra. Like millions of people worldwide, many people live in coastal areas. And as you see here in this Pacific island, not only do people work and live right on the coastline, they also have some of their most important values. Their communities are there. They bury their family members there. Many of their cultural heritage sites are right there on the coast. And you also have all sorts of interacting social and natural processes that we call risk. So that's the world as we know it. So we have a contrast. What is today and what could be in the future? So what is today? Our discussions reflect contemporary concerns. We're really concerned about people's safety and about their well-being. So discussions about dangerous landscapes, focus on surprise disruptions, impacts. Now, as I'm listening to you, lots of respect and great interest about the incredible resources, energy, intellectual capacity, the in-depth discussions that you're doing in relatively constrained spaces. And when I do this zoom out activity. And when I think about decades into the future with these different scenarios that Jacques was talking about, sometimes I feel a little overwhelmed because of the potential change that is upon us. And God forbid, actually, heaven help us, I hope that we're all wrong and that this climate change stuff is, that time will tell that it really actually wasn't anything like Y2K back in the day. I really hope that this would be a good question to be wrong about. But the consequences and the responsibility that we have are so great, it's really worth thinking through being prepared in the future. And this brings me into the what could be. So looking out into the future, what could be? Formal and informal institutions, and hopefully the international policy arena can help facilitate countries and everything that comes around national governments, the communities, the provinces. But hopefully we can help facilitate formal and informal institutions to co-develop norms that are appropriate for the world that we are creating. For those of you who are geologists, or for those of you who think about what I've heard about this age of Anthropocene, it's even hard to say, we are shaping our world. And sometimes it's got us into trouble, but we also have a tremendous ability as a global community to shape a good world ahead. And there are lots of trade-offs. And what I'm hoping, as much as I'm personally struggling with this idea of resilience, what I'm hoping is that whatever we do out in the right now that will shape our future, that it might have 3 characteristics. And I've listed those right here. I hope that we will be able to preempt and reduce risks. When we talk about what's out ahead, a lot of times, at least like in diplomatic circles, we talk with humongous enthusiasm about our aspirations. We love sustainable development goals. And we talk and talk and talk, and we're so excited about sustainable development for good reasons. Some of the difficult conversations are about the things that get in the way and why. In order to preempt and reduce risks, we need to make sure that we find ways to have those hard conversations about what gets in the way, and that we realistically reduce those things that get in the way to the amount that we can. And that leads into the second point of planning. I hope that our resilient future includes planning that includes all of us. One of the parts of the Sustainable Development Goals that catches my attention so much is that we commit not to leave anybody behind. We don't want to leave vulnerable people behind. That's part of our aspiration. This is going to be a really hard one. And it requires many trade-offs. And again, those very difficult discussions. But I hope that in our planning, that as we've heard from many of you, we can co-design our future together, and planning is a big part of that. Here I am talking to you as a planning community. And then finally, contingency arrangements. I hope that as we look into the future, that we will find some way, it's deeply uncertain. The better that we do with modeling, the more uncertain things become, which feels uncertain by nature, but I hope that we can think about contingency arrangements and have conversations about Plan Bs and Plan Cs. And not only about our built environment, but also about our values. And I'll get into that in just a second. So here we go, the world we are today, what is and what could be. So, struggling towards anticipatory strategies in a world that we don't even know yet. This is an infographic that we created in the work that I supervise on loss and damage in the climate negotiations. So what you see here is just a sketch of landscapes. You can probably find yourself in this landscape, where your families live, where you work. For those of you who are specialists on natural hazards, you'll probably see a bunch of natural hazard type things that you're familiar with. And what we do with this infographic is we always put it out in our meetings, and it's really interesting. People will congregate, when we put it in poster form, people will congregate around this poster and drink their coffee, and they'll have a conversation like, well, where do you live? And would sea level rise be an issue for you? And another colleague will say, no, actually, I live kind of on the side of that mountain, and for us, glacial melt is an issue. And others will say, well, I live down by that river. And right now, as the glacier is melting, we have really erratic flooding, but in the future, we're concerned about water availability. So this kind of graphic helps us start imagining the different interactions that we might need to take into account in the future. And here is a potential process that might take us into the future. I'm going to take an example from human mobility, and I'm drawing on our own research, but also the research that's out in the literature. And I'm going to show you 4 patterns of human mobility that's associated with these different climate stressors that we just looked at. So the first we'll refer to as displacement. Already worldwide, about 4 times as many people are displaced from weather-related and hazard-related events as from conflict. So we're talking about a lot of people today. The good news is that when harmony or stability is established, people try and go back home. Well, I guess it depends on how you look at it, but people try and return to where they're from. Another pattern that we see has to do with livelihoods. Worldwide, many people have livelihoods that are quite sensitive to weather and climatic parameters. When these people move, often it's sending a son or daughter to a nearby town. Sometimes, but not as often, people will send somebody farther away. And if they're lucky to either secure food or employment, they can send remittances back home. And those remittances can be another way that families achieve some stability. Another pattern that we see are complex forms of movement that sometimes interact with other stressors. And here I've represented that as conflict. If you remember, I showed that little picture of a UNHCR refugee camp. Many people who are vulnerable, in part because of conflict, might also struggle with erratic weather or climate stressors. Now, for these people, return isn't as certain. Today, people can return from previously conflict-torn areas again once stability is there again. But that depends on many, many factors, so we have some questions there. And the 4th pattern has to do with habitability, and this is where we know least. We don't understand enough about the degree to which human society and our built and natural environments interact, and we don't really know enough, not by any means, about how the environment, so I'm having a hard time finding the words because I know you know how much we interact with our environment and construct it, but we are changing the world that we live in. And some of the factors that we need for basic survival have to do with temperatures. We're all mammals. Our bodies need to cool down. We've been getting some really interesting research or modeling about potential future climate scenarios and heat waves. And if we have heat waves, let's say daytime temperatures above 50 degrees and nighttime temperatures that don't cool off below 36 degrees, people start having heat stress. This is one of the parameters. Availability of water, livelihoods, et cetera, raises the question about where we live and how we live. And this raises some, I've taken these examples of human mobility just as a thought experiment for all of us to think about where we live and how we live today and what that might look like in the future. And this brings us then almost into the future. So in the realm of climate policy, we're looking at these climate impacts and vulnerabilities and risks. And here I'm going to take an example, not that you could actually read this because it's in light blue font, but I'm going to take an example of one area that I supervise in the climate negotiations. what we're trying to do, working with governments of the world, and typically that means ministries of foreign affairs and environmental ministries. So we don't work with all the ministries, we work with usually a select set of ministries. But what we're trying to do is understand climate impacts, how they interact with human society, see if we can avert and reduce those risks, plan for them. We have a national adaptation planning process. Right now, that's in an on-ramp process to integrate with other types of national planning. And then finally, address those residual risks. And there you'll hear an echo of what I said right in the beginning about what I hope resilience might include: preempting and reducing risk, planning for it, and having a plan B or contingency plans. And we do this in a number of areas. And I'll just give you that information. It might be hard to read. So we have slow onset events, sea level rise, glacial melt, desertification, land degradation, and all those things that are kind of slow processes. We look at non-economic losses. For us, that means those kinds of climate impacts that don't necessarily carry a price tag, but that certainly have an impact on human society. And an example of this is loss of a sense of community, or loss of functions that we don't put a price tag on, or that we don't exchange in a marketplace, but which play a critical role in us getting along as human beings. And it goes on and on. Human mobility is also one of the areas that we work on. This is a further, more in-depth look at what we do, but in the climate policy world, we're so far removed from human settlements. And I hope what I can personally learn from all of you, and I hope what we can do together, is to help countries aspire to plans that they can implement. And now, after the Paris Agreement, you saw I put the Paris Agreement in the title of my talk. After the Paris Agreement, our work together is to help countries prepare for a world that they agreed to. And that world is a world between 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2 degrees centigrade. That might sound kind of, odd to express it that way, but just one example of what a world at 1.5 degrees centigrade might look like. If we're lucky, as much as we're learning from, and Torsten, maybe your colleagues can tell us water dynamics and all of those things, but if we're lucky, just as an example, glacial melt will stabilize and sea level rise, and everything that's around it will stop at about 1 meter above current sea levels. That's just one process that we're talking about. But a 1 meter sea level rise will certainly impact many of the coastal areas that we've seen in all of the wonderful maps that you've presented to us. A 2 degree world would be a different world in terms of risk. And this is just a 0.5 degree difference. And we're talking about that in the international community. So what we're trying to do is signal to countries and all of the communities that countries have responsibility for the bandwidth that they need to get prepared for. Now, we hopefully stay below that. It looks like we're likely going to possibly exceed that, but this bandwidth helps us get prepared. And ultimately, we decide together. This is the last schematic. We're shaping our world, and just like Jacques said, green is good and red is dangerous. So the world that we're aiming for is a series of decisions between now and those future times that will lead us to a world with greater opportunities, fewer risks in our physical environment, and greater social cohesion and greater social, or the opposite of social stress. But the choices are ours, and we know so many of the things that would be best practice. And so I just hope that in the future, now moving forward, that resilience will have at least those 3 characteristics, that we'll be able to avert risk and be wise, that we'll be able to plan for it, and put whatever contingency arrangements are needed to make sure that no vulnerable people are behind, and that we have a tendency to move up to that better and brighter future rather than to these dangerous landscapes down here. Thank you very much.